Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored in part by The Pursuit of Wisdom, a series of free courses on a variety of topics presented by the faculty of Ave Maria University. We invite you to start learning today by downloading the Pursuit of Wisdom app or visiting thepursuitofwisdom.org. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and today I am very happy to be joined by Ambassador Habsburg, who is also known as the Archduke Eduard of Austria, a diplomat and social media personality. Eduard and his wife have 6 children. Eduard is the author of several books. His most recent book, published by Sophia Institute Press, is Building a Wholesome Family in a Broken World, Habsburg Lessons from the Centuries. The book we'll be discussing today is his 2023 book, The Habsburg Way, 7 Rules for Turbulent Times. So welcome to the show, Ambassador Habsburg.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Well, this episode was really a joy to prepare for. By reading your book, I really felt as if I were beginning to immerse myself a little bit in the 800 years of Habsburg, ruling wisdom since 1273, right, when Rudolf began as the first king and emperor of the Holy Roman Empire.
Wow, you did your homework.
Well, it is really great to have you on the show. And maybe if you could just tell, listeners or viewers just a little bit about, how did you come up with the idea of the book? And for especially, for the American audience that may be rather unfamiliar with really probably, many of the details of the Habsburg, empire and legacy and monarchy, right? What were some goals that you were hoping to achieve by sharing, lessons from your family?
I was approached by Sophia Institute Press, whether I wanted to write a book about the Habsburgs. And I told them there are thousands of books about the Habsburgs. And I said, I only will write one if I find a special access to it. And of course, I wanted it to be a book for Americans. So what I wanted to go is to give I wanted to do 3 things. I wanted to give a very brief overview over the Habsburg family history in an entertaining way, trying to teach everybody 5 dates of our history. So you get an overview. The main reason for that are not the American readers. The main reason for that, I tell you a secret, is I've written this for the members of my family because some of the younger ones don't really read books. And as a Habsburg, you're not born with the knowledge about your family, so you have to somehow acquire that knowledge. And I thought to myself, if some of the younger generation I just want to get a quick overview, they just flip through the first 5 pages of my book and get an idea of our history. And at least they can talk with some competence about the family history because people expect them to know about Habsburg history. So the introduction with our most important history is just a few pages, gives you an overview, is mostly written for the Habsburg readers, but also, of course, for the American ones. And then my second aim was to make you get to know the most famous members of our family through the centuries. There is a beautiful American book written about this called The Habsburgs by Dorothy Guise McGuigan. It's from the 1950s, and I basically soaked that up when I was a boy. And it has all sort of little quirky stories and personal approaches to many from history. And I try to get that a bit across, that you meet well-rounded people, not just a history lesson. That's the second book. The most interesting bit was that I tried to give it a structure by saying I'm not going to write about the history alone. I want to think about the 7 principles that our family always stood for in 800 years of history. And while I was researching those principles, first by talking to elderly uncles, then by flipping through books, then by mostly reading the books of Otto Habsburg, the son of Blessed Emperor Karl, who was a great politician here in Europe and also came to the States, I began realizing that most of these 7 principles that I talk about have somehow been forgotten a bit in modern society. And going on writing, I said, well, let me offer these principles to everyone nowadays and say you can try to incorporate that into your life. And so the book became, first of all, very slim book, easy reading, one long afternoon if you flip through it. And Michael Knowles then said that it's a Habsburg self-help guide, which is very funny. But it was, for me, it was an incredible learning curve. And it's really so. The 7 principles that I propose, going through the centuries, you can almost see them shining out of those different characters. Some of them more, some of them less, but most of them have several of these 7 principles very clearly visible. And how did I find the principles? If you go on the street and ask someone with a bit of historic knowledge, what do the Habsburgs stand for? If you don't go on X, where they will tell you for the Habsburg jaw and for inbreeding, but if you go to normal people, they will immediately get to 1, 2, 3 of these points without me having to point them to it. But I thought, let's make it a bit broader, and that's how I came to 7.
I really love the approach, and I love the 7. We will get into them shortly. We're going to keep our audience a little bit on the edge of their seats for what are those 7 principles. But you tell a lot of great stories and great sayings. I wanted you maybe just to say a word or two about a couple of them. One of my favorites was that you said there's a Latin saying, bella gerant, alii tu felix Austria nube, right? Basically, others make war, you happy Austria marry.
Yes. It's, I think, supposedly from Matthias Corvinus, the Hungarian king and great rival of Frederick III. And it's very interesting. The Habsburgs, from the first minutes of their being, always were into marriage, family, having lots of children, and enlarging their power through marriage politics. Really very early on, not just in the 15th, 16th century, but before that, the first king of the Holy Roman Empire, Rudolf, who had, after he became emperor, who had to make peace with one of his most complicated rivals, which was Ottokar of Bohemia. His first approach was to try to marry his children to Ottokar's children. And it's a good approach, not for everyone involved sometimes, but for the peoples, yes. Because if I have a neighboring country and I marry my daughter to their son, the chance that we will have war is smaller, far smaller. It's very easy. And the Habsburgs never had the luxury from the beginning to have one nation with one language and then have the temptation to enlarge this by war. But from the beginning, they always looked after a hodgepodge, a mixture of different countries, different languages, different legal systems, and they had to keep it all together. And alliances of the marrying kind are very good to do that because, for instance, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire had no power, no money from the Holy Roman Empire, no ambassadors, no capital, no army that the empire gave him, and he was supposed to be the judge over all and keep everything together. You can only do this with peaceful, cautious, very slow 3D chess playing. And the Habsburgs did that from the beginning to the end. And you first saw it in the Holy Roman Empire, and then you saw it in the Habsburg Monarchy and Central Europe. It was always the same principles. And therefore, yes, the marrying part, of course, is really the first and the most famous one. And yes, you said that Latin line really well. Now you will ask where those princesses, those Habsburg archduchesses and archdukes that were married off, always happy to marry someone that they often only met the first time on their wedding day after a long trip somewhere. And before that only saw as a painting where you always had to ask the ambassador whether the painting actually looked like the person that was depicted on it. Of course, not always, but in a surprising amount of cases, those marriages were happy. And that's because, well, that's the topic of my second book, because the Habsburgs only married their children off to people who had the same principles, the same faith, the same idea of sacraments, the same ideas of marriage. And that is quite a good framework to have a happy marriage, even if that such important thing like emotions and romance that is so important for us today doesn't come into the equation right at the beginning.
Yeah, and you do see that the kind of leaning into the institution of marriage as a kind of I love the way you put it in terms of a cultural and even, governmental way of trying to foster communion without power, without, the Holy Roman Empire, as you put it, as an empire without an army, right? So how do you try to hold together people without kind of one language, without nationalism, and without an army? And you begin to think that maybe that's not such a bad way to hold together an empire. Right? I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said that he was writing about the League of Nations in Europe in the early part of the 20th century, maybe the predecessor to the European Union. But he said in some ways what they're trying to do today in the 20th century was just have a new Holy Roman Empire, but without the church. And the difficulty, of course, is that in some ways it's better with the church, because then the church that helps to unite it is also above it.
Yes. And that, I don't want to cut directly to the topic of the European Union, but that's, of course, one of the problems we have in the current European Union. We don't have a unifying principle, and we don't have a benign force above everybody that has the interests of the lowest levels at heart. But that's another talk. I want to give you one example where you see the principle that you just gave, the principle that without power you can build up a network of relations. One character who did that to absolute wonders was Empress Maria Theresia in the 18th century. She took over the empire as an heir, and a young woman of beginning 20s, just married with several small children, when her father surprisingly died. And several things happened at the same time when she took over the empire. The army was in a terrible state. The empire was financially in a bad state. The ministers were all old, and she was immediately attacked by several neighbors. Frederick of Prussia, the Bavarian prince, they all attacked immediately because they said, that's it, that girl, we're going to simply throw her out and take away everything. And then she was creative, and then she asked the Hungarians for help, which was very unexpected, and they did. And then in very few years, through her children, she built up an incredible network of power in Europe, flipped the entire balance of power in Europe by marrying her daughter off to the French king, who was always the enemy. And all of that through marriage, not through power, through money, and through armies. So, yes, that's a real principle. And one that is being ridiculed very often nowadays, but made a lot of sense for centuries.
Oh, that is great. So that was rule number 1, get married and have lots of children. The second rule you mentioned is be Catholic. You mentioned the story, which is probably not, of Rudolph I, where at a certain point he meets a priest and he gives away the horse. Yes. I don't know if do you remember that story, and do you want to share it with our audience?
I remember it very well, because it's sort of the founding myth of our family. And I'll tell you why it's especially important even in the 20th century. Rudolf was the Count of Habsburgs, and he lived in the forests around not too far away from Zurich in the Canton Aargau. And one day there was a heavy storm and a rain, and he was hunting in this forest, and the river was swollen, and the priest couldn't cross the river because it was swollen, and he had the viatic with him, the Blessed Sacrament, and he wanted to go to a dying man to bring him communion. And Rudolf gave him his horse and said, use my horse to cross the river and to go to the dying man. And when the priest came back in the evening to bring back the horse, Rudolf said, that be far from me that I ever ride again on a horse that carried my savior. Keep it. And the people in the area said, this is a great gesture, and God will give the Habsburgs a recompense for that. He will give them great wonders, and he will thank them for what they did. And funnily enough, and that's an incredible story if you think about it, in the 20th century, when the young future Empress Zita, Princess Zita of Bourbon-Parme, engaged to later Blessed Emperor Karl, who was then just Archduke Charles and not the heir to the throne, visited Pope Pius X in Rome. And she went there to get a blessing for their marriage. And Pius X received her and her mother. I know this story because one of my cousins spoke to Zita about this several times, so I know this exactly how it happened. And they went in, and the Pope received them, and the Pope said to her, I see you're going to marry the heir of the empire. And she said, no, you're confusing this. The heir of the empire is Franz Ferdinand. I'm only marrying Archduke Charles. And he said, no, I'm not confusing this. Your husband will be on the throne of Austria. And afterwards she came out and she told her mother, he got confused, poor guy. This, you confuse all those archdukes. Mother said nothing. And about 3 years later, there was Sarajevo, and Franz Ferdinand was killed. And then the mother said to her, I knew that he must have known something in his heart, that he was going to be emperor soon. So that's beautiful. But in that moment when he received Zita, he said, your husband is going to be the emperor, and he is God's thank you to the Habsburg family for their fidelity. And that is the man that became the first blessed of our family. And that goes directly back to Rudolf. It's really incredible. And if you read the 2 chapters I wrote about the Habsburg Catholic faith, you will see it's the longest bit in my book. Yeah. You will see that some of them were really thin soup, thin sauce, now you say, in American. Some of them were barely Catholic, but they were always Catholic. And some of them in their personal life didn't really live their Catholic faith well. But then there were other members in the family who did. And then always the great Catholics in the family came back. And they stood the test of time, the test of Reformation, and remained Catholic. And we are today all Catholic. Of course, with all the bandwidth that you have within the Catholic Church, you have more traditional Catholics and you have more open Catholics. But all of us are Catholics. We all get married and have lots of children. We love the Pope. And that's one. Isn't it incredible? We're around since the year 1000 and it's still the same story. So Catholic faith is the big flag flying about our family.
I love those stories. And I thought it was very interesting how you spoke about just how much, in some ways, the Protestant Reformation had made inroads to much of the empire. And yet at the same time, how, especially I think it was Ferdinand II, really led a huge reform and renewal as part of the, Catholic, what's been called the Counter-Reformation. And this really recovery. And so we often think of these very Catholic countries, but in some ways that was the result of leadership. It wasn't an accident.
Yes, I one of the greatest stories in my book and one of my greatest stars in the Habsburg family is Archduchess Magdalena. And it is so interesting. Under the time of Ferdinand I, brother of Charles V, so we're in the 16th century, Protestantism goes like a wildfire through all of Europe, and large parts of Austria are absolutely changed into what you would now call Protestant region. Most of the priests had married men. Most of the monasteries were about to die, closing down one every week, and all the important aristocrats in the country became Protestants. And the emperor Maximilian II was really weak sauce. He had he had been raised by an educator who later was turned out to be a close friend of Luther. And he had a Luther Bible on his nightstand. Very bad stuff. And when the nuncio of the Pope came to Austria to convince the Habsburgs to bring Counter-Reformation to Austria and make their homelands Catholic again, they knew they couldn't go to Maximilian because Maximilian was just very, very weak. So they went to his sister, Magdalena, who had founded a monastery in Tyrol in Austria. And she was good. She was really good. And she went first to her brother in Tyrol, then to her brother in Styria. Together they went to her sister who had married the Prince of Bavaria. And then they made a conference in Munich in 1579, I think, where they devised a plan how to take back Austria for the Catholic faith. It was very impressive stuff. And that's how in about 30 years, Austria was Catholic again. They basically went village to village. And when a Catholic priest was married, they threw out the wife. And then they asked him whether he wanted to live according to his vows again. If yes, he was accepted. If not, he was locked into the cellar with bread and water for 1 week, for 2 weeks. The good old pastoral measures to convince people. And that, and of course, preaching the work of the Jesuits and the examples of the Habsburgs. And another story where you see personal leadership and also the importance of parents is Maximilian II, as I told you, was not a very Catholic ruler. His successor was Rudolf in Prague, and he was really a problematic man. His brother Matthias was a bit better, but Ferdinand II, who then became emperor, was a great champion of Counter-Reformation, and he wasn't supposed to become emperor. He just became emperor because of a series of events. And he, when his father died in Styria, he made a pilgrimage to Italy, and he went to Loreto, and he promised to Our Lady of Loreto in the house of the Holy Family that he will bring Austria back to the Catholic faith. And that's what he did afterwards. Personal leadership is important too, not just, yes.
Yeah, and I think one thing too that's helpful to remember about those years is that often the Protestant reformers were not kind of appealing to the hearts and minds of the listeners. The majority of those times had been often imposed by political authority.
Yes.
So
Yes.
So it was kind of in that time period, almost all the majority of religious questions in terms of political identities were determined by authority.
Yes,
right.
Cuius regio, eius religio. All the people in my country have the same bit, and of course, it made a lot of sense to become a Protestant because you could disinherit the church of their entire properties and give them to your followers. That's very helpful. That's what happened in England. It's very difficult to resist the temptation.
Yeah. So no, it's really kind of beautiful to see how to really recover these, kind of the soil in some ways in which the church can live. And it's awkward at times, I think, for kind of moderns to think about and talk about, but the church needs political support, right? If the political authorities do not recognize the church's ability to exist, to own property, to preach the gospel, the church will have a harder time thriving, right? And inevitably, the political regimes are not neutral, right? They will either begin to support the church or they will begin to suppress the church.
Our government is very much encouraging the churches to play an important role in society. Our constitution says that church and state are clearly separated, but work together for the good of society. So with us, we even have it in our constitution.
Yeah, that's great. So we have 5 more rules to go through. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll move forward. Thank you.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
It is interesting. You wrote this book. It's published by an American press, Sophia Institute Press. And you've given, I think, lots of talks in the United States and been on lots of podcasts that are primarily in the United States. So what do you think is especially something that kind of maybe, Catholics or really just any citizens in the United States can kind of, benefit from learning more about this kind of monarchical dynastic tradition?
One of the greatest surprises when I researched this book was the number of relevant ties and bridges between the Habsburg monarchy and the United States. Historical ties and also content ties, ideas that are the same. You wouldn't think that because the United States basically are built upon the idea of fighting cruel tyrants and building up a republic and a democracy against that, and you would say so. I'm just going to throw out one or two or three things. History-wise, many of the American states are old Habsburg territories. I include California, Texas. On the first governor of Texas was put there by the Spanish Habsburgs. Think of that. Above the door of the governor's palace in, I think in Los Alamos, is a double eagle. Florida, old Habsburg territory. America had a long Catholic Spanish-speaking history before the whole Protestant history began, and the Habsburg played a role in that. The other thing is, of course, that the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburg Empire and the United States share a very important principle, and that's subsidiarity. And that's how we get to the third chapter that I think is very important in my book. It's not the third, it's the fourth. It's the third topic, the third principle, which is stand for the empire and for subsidiarity. Because basically the United States are built grassroots up, bottom up. You begin on the level of the homestead, of the township, of the state, and those are the really important levels. And the federal level, the higher you get up, the weaker in theory, the United States are built. Now, of course, the federal level has gained a lot of power over the last 100 years, but in theory, you can still feel in the states this incredible respect for the lowest level. This is a very key element of Habsburg thought. There is a letter by Charles V to his son Philip II, where he says, if you rule over several countries, you have to respect their local laws, their local parliaments, their local rights, their languages, or you'll be in big trouble. Which is, in a very 16th century way, the principle of subsidiarity. And it's a principle that is still a big topic nowadays. When the European Union was built in Article 5 of their founding charter, is about subsidiarity. So, in theory, every growing together of several nations to one entity should be based on subsidiarity. If you don't have that, if you have centralism, if you have a powerful bureaucracy centralizing power, whenever that happened in the Habsburg Empire, it led to trouble. Whenever the Habsburgs respected the single nations and the lowest level, the empire thrived. And that is an American thing. I believe you could see during the, for instance, difficult times with an unnamed disease a few years ago, and other situations, that the single states still have power. They can still make decisions against the federal level, and that's an incredible power of the United States, because you are, and never forget it, United States. You are not just America, you are the United States of America. And I would say that the Habsburg monarchy, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, was in a way United States under, of course, the leadership of the Habsburgs. But still, in the parliament in Vienna, you spoke, I think, 11 languages, and everybody had the right to use his own language. So yes, there are lessons to be learned, and there is surprising closeness in principles between an old monarchy and the United States.
Yeah, that's really insightful. And I love the way that you identify kind of a different way of being empire. I think most of us assume that the way of being empire is in the model of maybe, Alexander the Great, some of the Greek and some of the Roman, where they began to impose and instill one language, one law, one citizenship that mattered, and obviously countless versions of that over the last millennia. But that
Star Wars,
but
the Empire.
yeah, Star Wars, right? Exactly. The Emperor and the Empire are bad, but this idea that actually, an authentic empire can be a way of trying to help nations not fight one another in war. And it's the irony is what people want and what they imagine from this somehow post-national, almost kind of this Marxist future of pan-globalism without nations and without war, was the closest we've gotten to that in some ways was through these loose empires that held countries together, but also allowed them to genuinely be their own countries and their own nationalities.
I can quote a very famous American whom I had the real privilege to meet 6 months before he died. I had 45 minutes alone with Henry Kissinger. And one of the first things, I gave him, of course, my book. And he thanked me and he said, I'm going to read it because I'm a great fan of the Habsburgs. And I said, oh, are you? And he said, yes, because as long as the Habsburgs ruled, Europe, and especially Central Europe, worked and functioned and thrived. The moment they were taken out of the equation, everything went wrong in Central Europe and in Europe. And that's strong words for an American, right? But of course, you have to understand, he was born 3 years after Blessed Emperor Karl died in Madeira. So he really harked from a different era. And he could think in the way one thought between the wars. But still, this is an American and a great political thinker that you can agree with or not. But the idea that a monarchy actually could have been something good, which was, it was over the last 10,000 years, because it was always monarchy. There were a few, democracy here and there. It was mostly monarchy. It's the state, the state that humans are made, and it is, according to Catholic teaching, still the best form of government. And the idea that a monarchy could be good for the subjects is unthinkable. And therefore, in my book, especially in the chapter where I speak about stand for justice and for your subjects, I think it's called like that, I try to give a few examples of monarchs that rule today, who are, of course, very weak and very far echoes of what the monarchy once was, all those constitutional monarchies in Europe. But still, and I got to know a few of those people who are now kings and queens in Europe when they were in training. And you saw people who, with every fiber of their being, were prepared to serve their country and their subjects. They knew about every fault line in the country. They knew about every problem. They personally had gotten to know all the religions, all the parties, all the social strata. They could watch their parents trying to handle this, and they could go back until their grandparents, how they dealt with certain problems. And I was impressed because meeting this kind of person, you think like, how are our political leaders today? They get elected, they get into a position, then for a few years they do politics, and then very often they find a plum job somewhere in business or somewhere else, and they never have to care about the country again. While a monarch is in it for life, and his children will carry the trouble he sows. So he will think really well what he does or she does. And, these are things that most people don't think about because monarchy is usually a cliche in a movie. And that's not how it was. A monarch in the ideal state is the guarantor of right and of justice for his subjects. As one of my ancestors said to the Hungarians at some point in a letter, I grant you the right to take up arms against me if I don't respect your rights. That's incredible.
That is beautiful. And one of the big arguments against a monarchy is, what do you do with a bad monarch, right? And of course, that same argument is against democracy. People don't realize it. What do you do when the majority of a given people become corrupt? Right? Democracy won't. I think the founders of the United States saw this very clearly, that the tyrannies of the majorities and their particular dislike of whatever's whoever's only voting 45%. But one of the things I did, if I can ask one a little bit more provocative and perhaps a little bit more controversial question, but Woodrow Wilson, I think, who was one of the people who really helped kind of break apart the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and said he wanted to make the world safe for democracy, and kind of helped break up the Austro-Hungarian Empire I think it was 1918, and then I think finally in 1921.
Yes.
And ironically, by breaking apart all of the Eastern European and Central European countries, what happened was the rise of National Socialism, the Nazis in the West, and then the Soviet Union in the East taking over all of those countries because they all became fragile rather than being held together. So so it's like by making countries safe for democracy, you actually made them unsafe. So I know that's a huge topic. That's a book in itself. But if you could just maybe, just say a word or two about just maybe lessons learned.
Yes, it's not so easy. And systems that have grown over centuries very often have a good reason why they're still there. And we live in a time where tradition or anything that has grown slowly is seen as crazy, useless, and you should be someone else every day and change your identity, which of course leads me directly to one of my other points, which is know who you are. And I strongly believe we live in a time where people are glued to the screen, and the screen tries to keep us separated, alone, and unhappy. And because then we will buy. Our masters in the internet want us to buy, and we only buy if we're alone, unhappy, and separated from each other. And the screen, the phone does that really well. And the good thing, if you have a large family with 6 children, you can't afford phones for everybody. You can't afford computers for everybody. You can't buy the latest models. You learn from the beginning that consuming is not the solution to your unhappiness. I'm of course preaching here, but what I'm saying is, it is good to know where you come from. It is good to know what your roots are, what you are, that you are a man or a woman, that what your parents believed in. You can still say, okay, I know what my parents believed in, but I want to stand against that. But simply trying to cut yourself off from everything that's happened before and reinvent yourself every 5 minutes will only make one thing: that will put you into a psychiatric hospital on the long term.
Yeah, Otto, I think your uncle Otto von Habsburg, you quote on page 105 in this rule number 5, know who you are and live accordingly. One of his signature lines was, "Those who don't know where they come from do not know where they are heading because they don't know where they stand."
Yes. It sounds totally duh. It sounds like, well, we should all know that, but it's like you have to tell people the simplest things nowadays because everything is put in question. Otto, he always repeated that line. I remember in his speeches, but also when he sat together with us, I remember his voice. He always said it in German. He said, "Wer nicht weiß, woher er kommt, weiß nicht, wohin er geht, weil er nicht weiß, wo er steht, meine lieben Freunde." I had it hammered into my head. And years later, when I wrote the book, I realized, oh boy, he knew what he was talking about. And yes.
Yeah, so the last two ones are be brave in battle and have a great general, and die well. But there are lots of great stories about the battles. Maybe a word about Lepanto, which has a little bit of a following in the United States and is celebrated, of course, worldwide in the church in Our Lady of the Rosary, the battle. And also, I really want to hear about this great Archduke Charles and Napoleon, who led a charge against Napoleon and defeated Napoleon, and that was one of the first defeats of Napoleon, correct?
The first
in 1809.
The first defeat of Napoleon by Habsburg. So just to say, Lepanto, I celebrate it every year. I usually put on X a picture of either the bottle of Lepanto cognac or the rosary of both. We also have a tradition in the family to celebrate Lepanto, mostly by praying a rosary, also by sharing a glass of Lepanto cognac. It was a Habsburg that was in charge of that naval battle. It was Don Juan de Austria, an illegitimate child of Charles V, who was then legitimized by Charles' son, Philip II, and had a brilliant military career. We sometimes had brilliant archdukes in our family, militarily brilliant. We had lots of brilliant, but in the military, there were a few real brilliant ones, and Don Juan was that. I give a lot of the credit for the success of this battle to Pope Pius V, because he basically, by diplomacy, brought together the alliance. But in the battle, of course, the soldiers went into battle with a rosary in hand. They had confessed, and Don Juan himself said, whoever curses during the battle or takes the Lord's name in vain will be court-martialed. So he wanted Christian soldiers, and it was an overwhelming victory, and it broke forever the power of the Ottoman, of the Muslim sea force in the Mediterranean, which had been terrorizing the entire Mediterranean. This was a case of a Habsburg that really led the charge, among others, and the other one was, of course, the incredible Archduke Charles. His story is so wonderful that I hope one day someone will make a great film about the Battle of Hapsburg, because it was a gruesome, brutal 2-day battle of brilliance, really brilliant. So we have to see, when Napoleon swept Europe with his armies, nobody could stand up to him. And least of all, one of the poor generals of the Austrian army, which was the very, very brilliant and very clever Archduke Charles, who at least was able to fight honorably and lead his armies to security several times in different battles, until finally his brother, the emperor, decided to put him in charge of the army and to totally reform the army. And Charles had studied the French, and what he did was prepare the Austrians to fight the French by using French tactics. And the moment he did this, just very, very little afterwards, came the great test. Napoleon was already in Vienna. Of course, the emperor had fled, and he wanted to cross the river Danube near Vienna. And Archduke Charles had disposed his troops on the other side in a brilliant way. And then, while Napoleon was crossing, they floated down burning things, so that the army was always interrupted. So he could only land a part of the army, and that part of the army began the battle on the next day. And then it was a gruesome battle between the two armies near the village of Aspern. If you ever go to Aspern, which is not now a village, but a part of Vienna, there is a church, and near the church there's a museum. And that church burned. There's a famous painting of that church burning. And at the height of the battle, the French were about to break through the Austrian lines, and Archduke Charles, on his white horse, where you could see him from far away and kill him, he took the flag and he rode towards the enemy, just like Caesar did it several times in the Gallic War. And he turned around the battle, and that wasn't the end, but that was one moment where the Austrian lines would have broken down.
Yeah.
That image of this man on his horse is absolute iconic, and you see him as a statue on the Heldenplatz in Vienna.
Yeah.
He was a very humble man, also very happily married, deeply devout, and wonderful.
Yeah. And I think, again, it's just a little bit of an icon almost of, and not to, not that there aren't problems, with every family and every dynasty, so to speak, but we see that when the French Revolution destroys the monarchy in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity, what ends up happening is that Napoleon takes over and creates a militaristic empire that was much more destructive of the French and of Europe.
Yes.
Right. And so this is what happens. So you kind of have the new monarchy of the generals versus the old monarchy. And so it's kind of just a powerful scene and a great sense of what a king and a leader can do. We are getting close to the end of our time, but there's one I do want you to tell a little bit of briefly, if you can. This last one about dying well and have a memorable funeral. And this story, it just kind of brought chills to me that you were talking about here, that when the coffin comes in of the Habsburg's mortal remains, right, it goes through Vienna and it goes to the Capuchin, the Trappists' crypt. And then, 3 times on the door gets knocked. Who desires entry? Do you want to tell us what happens?
I can tell you because I saw it twice. And if you go on YouTube, you can still see the ritual being done. And it's very impressive and shows something about the Habsburgs and death. You knock on the door 3 times, who desires entry? And the first answer is the reading of all the titles of the emperor. And then the voice from inside, the Capuchin monk, says, we don't know him. And the second one is where you read all his achievements of his life. And again, the voice says, we don't know him. And then you knock a 3rd time. And the voice says, who is out there? And you say the name and you say, a poor mortal sinner. And then the door opens. That's the Christian message in a nutshell.
Yes. No, it really is. It's that beautiful thing that, holding these rituals and these titles and these institutions and these traditions, and holding them lightly, right? That all of us die and all of us will be judged. And that way of instantiating it, though, in the actual rituals, that when we die, we are a poor mortal sinner.
Yes.
That's it. And that's what allows us entrance. So that was just such a beautiful story. So I have 3 questions I like to ask my guests. So Ambassador Habsburg, what's a book you've been reading?
Goodness. So many. I'm an avid reader. I read all the time. I always have a book with me. I read. Lately, I am totally into Kipling. I love Kim. I love the Jungle Book. But Kim, most of all, Kim is an incredible, beautiful, humble, and very friendly about man book. I love Kim. I love Kipling. But my favorite book in the last years is probably Moby Dick by Melville. I read it every year. It is extraordinary. It's not an adventure yarn, but an encyclopedia of the world in the shape of a book about whaling.
What is a spiritual practice you do on a regular basis to discover meaning and draw yourself closer to Jesus Christ?
I show you. Is the rosary. It's a great thing. it works during the day, it works at night when you can't sleep. You've always got it in your pocket. And if you forget it, then you have your 10 fingers. It's a deeply meditative way of getting the reality of God in Christ and the salvation into your daily life while you do stressful things. And I can't praise it enough.
Great. And last question. This is a theology podcast, so ideas about God matter, right, for our lives. What is a belief you held about God that you discovered was incomplete or false? And what was the truth you discovered?
About God, yes. I think that I sometimes don't give God enough credit for the ability to act in our lives. I have a cynical and secular side in me that thinks like God doesn't really act in our lives, not in a spectacular way, until he does. And what really shocked me is, yes, perhaps that's the greatest discovery, which is, of course, totally normal, is if you take God seriously and let him into your life, and then 30 years later, you look back and you say, oh, that's incredible what he's done. And because you're very close up to it, you don't even notice these things. But then you turn around and says, I can't believe that we're here now. Yes, that's my greatest discovery. The amount of things he does in your life, when you look back, that's a big discovery.
That is beautiful. I think in many ways, the loss of trust in divine providence is probably one of the biggest trials of our contemporary society. So that is a beautiful way. And maybe just sometimes remembering that God's providence isn't going to be seen in the future, which we cannot see. It's not always really seen in the present, but it is really best seen in a way in the past, and retelling the Magnalia Dei, the wonderful things that God has done from beginning with the Exodus and, of course, in the great triumph of the resurrection and the ascension. Well, Ambassador Habsburg, thank you so much. Is there one final, maybe a word that you'd like to share with our audience about some of your books, or just your own life of faith with Jesus Christ?
Well, first of all, you gave everything away in the book. How could you? No, what I really want to say is, if you are on X, follow me on X. We can interact. If you just look for Eduard Habsburg, there's only one out there. I still have a number of followers that allows me to react to direct messages. My direct messages are always open, and I enjoy nurturing a wholesome atmosphere around my X account. I'm a friendly guy, and I want people around me to be that too. And by doing that, we can construct spaces of wholesomeness in this crazy world. And so do join me and come and visit me on X. And I would like to get to know you, all of you people listening to this wonderful show.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador. And thank you for that invitation to further fellowship and conversation. Using, in a way, these online technologies to put us in communion and connection is a beautiful way. And hopefully we're doing that right now. And again, thank you so much for listening to the show. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing and sharing the podcast with your family and friends. And again, the book today was Ambassador Eduard Habsburg, The Hapsburg Way, 7 Rules for Turbulent Times, with Sophia Institute Press. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being on the show today.
Thank you for a very interesting conversation.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.